Across the burning battlefield of space, where shattered ships drifted like broken bones and destroyed planets glowed with silent fire, 5 powerful alien empires surrounded a dead gray moon. Their massive fleets forming a ring of pride and arrogance, each empire believing they were the strongest, each commander convinced the war would end with their flag raised above the galaxy. And in the middle of this war zone, hidden among wreckage and dust, drifted something so small, so plain, so insignificant-looking that no one paid attention at first. A dark metal shape, old, rusty, broken, turning slowly in the cold void like forgotten trash. And when the scanners finally picked it up, the first reaction from every alien bridge was laughter. Loud, mocking laughter that echoed across the ships. Because the object was clearly a warship, but it was tiny, outdated, dented, covered in scorch marks and torn armor. A design so ancient that even the oldest empire didn't recognize it. And the commanders joked that it belonged in a museum, that it must be thousands of years old, that it was probably human scrap left over from some primitive age when Earth still crawled in the dirt. And one commander sneered and said, "Humans always were backward. Look at this relic." They probably thought this was a battleship, and the fleets laughed harder, their arrogance filling the comms, because in their minds humanity was weak, low-tech, unimportant. A species the galaxy had outgrown and forgotten. A species that built simple machines, slow engines, small weapons, and this drifting wreck seemed to prove their beliefs perfectly. A floating joke in the middle of a grand war. But then, as protocol demanded, the empires decided to scan it, not because they feared it, but because they wanted to know what kind of pathetic junk humans once built. And as the scanners locked onto the ship, as waves of energy pulsed toward the rusty hull, something strange happened. Something so small and so fast that the operators thought it was a glitch. The scan bounced back, not just reflected, but reflected with force, like the ship had scanned them back, and a few confused techs frowned, double-checked their systems, thinking it was an error. But before they could fix anything, every scanner across 3 fleets flickered, sputtered, and then overloaded, screens flashing red, alarms firing, lights blinding, and a wave of panic rushed through the control rooms as systems began shutting down without reason. Weapons going dark, shields flickering, engines pausing, and suddenly the laughter stopped, replaced by stunned silence as commanders stared at their dying consoles, unable to speak, unable to understand how a tiny, rusted ship could break their technology. And the technicians began shouting, voices full of shock and fear, reporting that the system failure wasn't random, wasn't accidental, wasn't natural. The old human ship was doing it. The primitive vessel was somehow disrupting every scan, every signal, every system pointed at it. And before anyone could react, before they could pull back, a second wave hit, stronger, sharper, darker, like a pulse of invisible force that slammed into the fleets. And screens across all 5 empires went black for a single long second, just one breath of darkness. But that second felt like death, because in that moment every ship was blind, every weapon useless, every defense offline. And when the systems flickered back to life, the first thing that appeared on every screen was a new reading. A reading that made every heart freeze, every commander go pale, every soldier go silent. The human ship was powering up, its core was active, its systems were charging, its weapons were waking, and the rusty hull that once looked dead now showed faint glowing lines under the metal. Tiny pulses of light pulsing like a heartbeat. Slow but steady, ancient but alive, and panic erupted across the fleets, officers shouting, commanders demanding answers, soldiers gripping their chairs and shaking hands, because nothing about this made sense, nothing about this wreck should have been able to power up. Nothing so old and primitive should have energy signatures stronger than entire dreadnoughts. And one terrified operator whispered, barely able to breathe, "This isn't junk, it's asleep." And those words hit the room with the weight of a planet, because everyone suddenly understood what their scanners had missed. This ship wasn't dead, it was dormant, waiting, resting, holding something inside it like a sleeping monster under stone. And now it was waking, and the fear spread like fire, burning through arrogance, burning through pride, burning through the belief that humans were weak. Because this primitive ship was defying every law of science, every database record, every known design. And as new scans tried to read its structure, the computers began spitting out impossible data. Unknown alloy, unknown energy type, unknown weapon class, unknown origin, unknown everything. And then the worst message of all appeared in bright red letters. Target lock detected. And commanders stared in horror as they realized the ship was scanning them, choosing targets, silently marking every vessel in every fleet, and suddenly the destroyed moon didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a trap, a quiet graveyard where something ancient and human had been waiting for the galaxy to get close enough, mocking them, testing them, warning them, and one admiral's voice broke as he whispered, "What did humans build?" Because the power readings were rising higher and higher, climbing past levels seen only in myth, in ancient legends of superweapons humanity once crafted during forgotten wars, and fear turned into pure terror as the rusty plates on the ship shifted, scraping open like old armor waking from rust, revealing smooth, black metal underneath. Perfect, untouched, lethal, and the entire battlefield fell silent, fleets frozen, hearts pounding, minds screaming, because they finally understood the nightmare truth. This warship wasn't ancient because it was outdated, it was ancient because it had survived. It had lived through wars the galaxy had forgotten. It had been built for something far greater than any empire could imagine, and now, after centuries of silence, it was waking, and no one knew why, no one knew how, no one knew what it would do. But every soul felt the same cold terror in their blood. The same crushing realization that the galaxy had made a fatal mistake mocking humanity. Because the ship they called primitive was opening its eyes even as fear began to creep into the edges of their minds. The five empires refused to accept what they were seeing. Refused to admit that a human ship, an old, rusty, primitive-looking thing, could be anything more than junk, and instead of listening to their instincts, instead of respecting the unknown, they clung to their pride like armor, convincing themselves that the power surge was a glitch, a coincidence, a harmless malfunction, and the commanders forced laughter back into their voices, mocking the ship again, louder this time, like children trying to shout over their own fear, calling it a toy, a scrap pile, a fossil from a weak species that never mattered. And across the communication channels, broadcasts went live. Cameras focused, voices confident, as the empires made a public announcement to the entire galaxy, telling billions of watching civilians that they had discovered a pathetic human relic. Claiming humans were so primitive they left useless trash floating in space, and massive crowds across the galaxy laughed, cheered, mocked Earth, repeating old jokes about humans being slow, emotional, tiny, insignificant. And the commanders fed that arrogance, waving their weapons proudly, saying they would destroy the ship as an example, a demonstration of their dominance, a reminder that the galaxy's greatest powers ruled without challenge, without question, without fear of anyone. Least of all Earth, and Admiral Zatha of the Varel Empire stood tall on his bridge, lifting his chin with smug confidence as he declared, "We will erase this relic in one shot." And his soldiers roared with excitement, thrilled by the chance to humiliate a species they considered beneath them, while Emperor Vesk of the Tyrant Coalition smirked on his throne ship and said, "Let this be a warning to all primitive worlds. Power belongs to us." And his followers raised their fists, clapping, celebrating, and all across the fleets the arrogance spread like poison, drowning out the small voices of doubt, drowning out the nervous looks from young officers who wondered why the scanners broke, why the alarms screamed, why the ship was waking. But every time someone tried to speak their fear, a superior silenced them, shouting that humans were weak, shouting that nothing human could ever threaten the galaxy, and that ignorance felt safe, it felt easy, it felt comfortable, because facing the truth, that they didn't understand what they were dealing with, was too terrifying, too painful, too humiliating. So they covered their panic with pride, telling themselves that technology defined power, and their ships were bigger, newer, stronger. So they must be invincible, and in the largest flagship, a young technician named Mora stood frozen at her console, her hands trembling as she stared at the ship's energy readings climbing higher and higher. Readings that should have been impossible, readings that made her stomach twist with dread, and she whispered to her captain, her voice shaking, "Something is wrong. This ship is not primitive." But her captain smirked and waved her away, calling her foolish, telling her humans never built anything advanced. Telling her she was letting fear cloud her mind. And her heart broke a little, because she could feel the truth deep in her bones, feel the danger rising like a wave about to crash. But no one would listen, no one wanted to listen, and in her chest a cold loneliness spread, because she understood what arrogance did. It blinded, it deafened, it killed, And meanwhile the galaxy watched the broadcast, and comedians made jokes about the ship's rust, children pointed and laughed, news anchors called the discovery the funniest moment in the war, and the five empires basked in the attention, loving the spotlight, loving the praise, loving the idea that they were about to crush a human relic in front of billions, turning destruction into entertainment, and they began charging their weapons, powering up cannons, preparing missiles, aiming every barrel they had at the small, silent human ship, believing the blast would be quick, easy, and glorious, and Admiral Zather lifted his arm, ready to give the attack order, smiling with twisted joy as he imagined the ship breaking apart, imagined the galaxy cheering his name, imagined Earth being humiliated forever, and he shouted across every channel, "Watch closely. This is what happens to primitive trash." And the fleets cheered with savage pride, their arrogance reaching its highest peak, but deep inside Mora's heart, and in the hearts of a few silent soldiers scattered across the fleets, a cold, heavy fear pulsed, because they could feel something that pride refused to admit. The primitive ship was not weak, not harmless, not dead, and the moment the empires fired, something terrible would awaken. And as Admiral Zather's hand began to fall, signaling the attack, the battlefield held its breath, and every silent instinct inside the universe seemed to whisper a warning. Their arrogance was about to cost them everything. The moment Admiral Zather's hand dropped, the universe seemed to exhale, and in a single heartbeat the five empires unleashed their power, thousands of cannons firing at once, beams of burning plasma screaming across space, missiles ripping through the void like falling stars, shockwaves tearing open the darkness as every ship poured its full strength into the tiny, rusty human warship drifting near the broken moon, and for a few seconds the battlefield became pure light, blinding, roaring, violent light that swallowed the old ship completely, turning it into a glowing storm of explosions that lit up the faces of cheering commanders, laughing soldiers, celebrating civilians watching the broadcast across the galaxy, because they believed this was the end, believed the ancient human relic had been erased, believed their attack had proven once and for all that humans were weak, that their technology was obsolete, that the empires were unstoppable. But as the light began to fade, as the explosions finally died down, as the smoke scattered into the cold void, every cheering voice began to falter, every smile began to tremble, every laugh began to choke into silence, because through the dying haze, through the fading fire, through the drifting ash of missiles, the warship was still there, completely untouched, not cracked, not scorched, not even dented, floating in the exact same position as before, as if nothing had happened at all, and a cold silence crushed the battlefield. A silence so heavy it felt like a hand gripping every throat. Because no one understood what they were seeing, no one had words, no one could believe that the most powerful fleets in the galaxy had fired everything they had, and done nothing, absolutely nothing. And Admiral Zather's eyes widened in horror, his smug confidence evaporating into raw fear as he whispered, voice barely audible, impossible. And on another flagship Emperor Vesk stumbled backward, his legs shaking, his heart pounding painfully in his chest, as technicians frantically checked data, checked weapons logs, checked damage reports, but every screen showed the same terrifying result. No damage detected, 0% impact, 0% penetration, 0 effect. And the emotional shock ripped through the fleets like a scream trapped in silence, because they had never failed like this, never faced something immune to their weapons, never imagined that a primitive ship could ignore the full power of five empires as if it were dust blowing against a mountain, and panic began to rise, voices trembling, breaths shaking, eyes filling with fear, as soldiers asked, how is that possible? What is that ship made of? What kind of shield can survive that? But no answer came, because no one knew, no one had ever seen technology like this, no one had ever heard of a material that could endure that kind of assault. And in the center of the chaos, Mora, the young technician who had warned her captain, felt tears burn in her eyes, not from relief but from terror, because she understood what the commanders refused to accept, understood that the ship's silence, its stillness, its inaction was not weakness, it was choice, and that realization chilled her to the core. Because if the ship could survive all that without moving, without activating shields, without firing a single weapon, then what would happen when it chose to respond? What kind of power did it hold inside? What ancient force was waiting beneath that rusty shell? And on every bridge, every commander tried to speak, tried to regain control. But their voices came out broken, shaking, uncertain, because they could feel the shift in the air. Feel the universe changing, feel the truth creeping into their bones. This ship was not old junk. This ship was not primitive. This ship was something far beyond them, something they were never meant to challenge, and as the shattered moon drifted behind it, casting long shadows across its hull, faint lines of glowing light appeared again, brighter now, pulsing like veins of energy under the metal skin, and a deep, rumbling vibration rippled through space. So low and so ancient it felt like the breath of a sleeping beast beginning to stir, and that sound, that tiny vibration, sent pure terror shooting through every soul in the fleets, because they knew. Whatever was inside that ship was waking, slowly, deliberately, like a predator lifting its head after centuries of silence, and Admiral Zather tried to speak, tried to command a retreat, tried to warn his allies, but when he opened his mouth, no words came, only a quivering breath, because the truth finally hit him with crushing force. They had attacked something they did not understand, provoked something older and stronger than anything in their databases, and they had woken it. And as the glowing lines spread wider, brighter, hotter, scanning beams flickered from its hull, locking onto every fleet, every ship, every engine, every weapon. And then, in a moment so quiet it hurt, a single message appeared on every screen, written in cold, perfect text. First strike recorded, and that message shattered whatever pride remained, because it carried the terrifying implication the fleets could no longer deny. Their attack had been the first move, and now, whatever this warship truly was, it had the right, the reason, and the power to strike back. For a long, trembling moment after the message first strike recorded appeared, the battlefield felt frozen in time, as if the universe itself refused to breathe, and every alien heart pounded with a silent terror that no weapon had ever created before, because those three simple words meant something final, something irreversible, something terrifying. This ancient human warship had not only survived their attack, it had recognized it, judged it, remembered it, and now it was responding, and as the glowing veins of light spread across its rusty hull, every soldier, every commander, every leader felt the same crushing realization. This ship was not reacting in panic, it was reacting in purpose, like it had been built for this moment, prepared for this moment, waiting for this moment, and the fear that followed was so thick it felt like drowning, because no one in the Five Empires had ever seen a warship behave like this, so calm, so controlled, so alive, and Admiral Zather, once proud and loud, now stood stiff and shaking, staring at the ship with wide, terrified eyes as a deep rumble echoed through space, a rumble that didn't sound mechanical, didn't sound artificial, but sounded almost like a heartbeat, slow, heavy, ancient, and that sound crawled under every alien skin, filling their minds with one horrifying truth. This was no dead machine. This was something alive in the only way a war could understand, and as the glowing lines connected, forming patterns across the surface, old plates of rusted armor began to shift, grinding open with a metallic groan that felt like the awakening of a sleeping titan, revealing beneath them not rust, not damage, but smooth black metal, polished and perfect, untouched by time, untouched by the universe, untouched by their weapons, and technicians gasped, voices breaking, because the rusty exterior had been a shell, a mask, a disguise hiding something impossibly advanced, impossibly powerful, impossibly human, and the glowing lights grew brighter, pulsing faster, forming circuits, spreading toward the gigantic engine at the ship's core, and suddenly energy readings spiked so violently that every scanner across every fleet screamed warnings, red lights flashing, alarms howling, systems glitching as engineers shouted that the power building inside the ship was beyond any known limit, beyond logic, beyond science, and Emperor Vesk, once confident and sneering, now clutched the armrests of his throne, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he whispered, voice cracking, "This cannot be human." But deep down he knew, they all knew, that it was human, unmistakably human, terrifyingly human, because only a species that had survived the impossible would build something this silent, this patient, this unstoppable, and the panic spread like fire, soldiers screaming, officers begging for orders, ships trembling as retreat commands collided with pride. But no one could move, no one dared turn away, because the ship's scanning beams were still locked onto them, holding them in place like invisible chains, and every captain feared that any sudden movement would trigger something far worse. And then, without warning, the ship's engines ignited. Not with flames, not with thrusters, but with a deep, crushing wave of gravitational energy that rippled through space like a pulse from the heart of a star, pressing against every ship, every hull, every bone, forcing soldiers to gasp for breath as pressure hammered their bodies. And Mora, the young technician who had sensed the danger, felt tears spill down her cheeks as she whispered, "It's waking up, fully waking up," and the emotional weight of those words hit harder than any cannon. Because they all understood now, the warship had been asleep, dormant, silent, and they had been foolish enough to strike it first, foolish enough to believe it was harmless, foolish enough to judge humanity's power by the rust on its skin. And Admiral Zatha tried to command a retreat, his voice cracking with terror, but before he could speak, before any fleet could move, the warship released a deep, resonant vibration that shook the airwaves, crashing into every communication channel, silencing every signal, forcing every screen across the fleets to flicker and reset. And then a new message appeared, calm, cold, absolute, written in a language older than any empire but translated perfectly: "Do not fire again." And those 4 words hit every mind like a hammer, because they were not a request, not a plea, not a warning. They were an order, spoken with the confidence of something that had nothing to fear, nothing to lose, nothing to prove. And Admiral Zatha's breath shattered in his chest as he realized the true horror. Not only did this warship survive them, not only did it judge them, it believed itself in control, believed it had authority, believed it had the right to command 5 empires. And the worst part was, it did, because not one ship dared to disobey, not one commander dared to breathe, not one empire dared to fire, and the silence that followed was not the silence of discipline, not the silence of strategy. It was the silence of surrender, quiet, unconscious surrender born from pure terror, because inside every heart a single truth now echoed. A truth they had refused to believe until this moment. The ship they mocked, the ship they called primitive, the ship they laughed at, was stronger than all of them combined. And as the glowing veins reached the ship's weapons array, as the massive cannons began to unfold like wings of a mechanical beast, every soul in the fleets felt their pride die, their arrogance collapse, their certainty crumble, because they finally understood what had risen before them, finally understood what humanity had left behind in the dark, finally understood the nightmare they had awakened. This was not a relic of the past. This was a warning from a species the galaxy should have never underestimated. And now, it was awake. The moment the warship's weapons began to unfold, a cold terror settled over the 5 empires like a shadow that could not be escaped, and every soldier felt their heartbeat stumble, every commander felt their breath lock in their throat. Because they all knew what came next, they all knew what retaliation meant. They all knew that when something this powerful warned them not to fire again, the price for disobedience would be unimaginable. Yet fear twisted into panic, and panic twisted into denial, and denial twisted into one final desperate mistake. Because somewhere among the fleets, a trembling officer, driven by fear instead of logic, slammed his hand onto the firing control, screaming that they had to destroy the ship before it destroyed them. And in an instant a single missile shot forward, small compared to the earlier barrage, insignificant compared to the strength of 5 empires, but deadly enough to shatter what little hope remained. And as the missile streaked across the void, every soul screamed silently inside, knowing this act had sealed their fate, knowing the order "do not fire again" had been broken, knowing the ancient ship had been challenged once more. And when the missile struck the hull, it didn't explode, didn't burn, didn't even scratch the surface. It simply vanished, absorbed into the black metal like a drop of water into stone. And that horrifying sight shattered whatever strength was left in the fleets, leaving only trembling bodies, shaking voices, wide terrified eyes, because it proved a truth more terrifying than death itself. The warship hadn't even needed shields, hadn't needed to defend, hadn't even tried. It simply ignored the attack as if it was beneath its notice, as if the most advanced weapons in the galaxy were nothing more than dust blown against a mountain. And Admiral Zatha collapsed into his chair, hands shaking uncontrollably, mind spiraling into terror, because he understood now that the ship wasn't just strong, it was invincible, untouchable, unstoppable. And as he stared at the glowing lines racing across its hull, he whispered, voice breaking like glass, "We never had a chance." And those words echoed through the hearts of every commander, every soldier, every witness, because they all felt it too, the crushing weight of their mistake, the unbearable truth that they had woken something built not for intimidation, not for fear, but for annihilation. And then, without warning, the warship moved, not fast, not violently, but with slow, deliberate purpose, turning its massive weapon array toward the fleets, and the movement alone sent a wave of raw terror screaming through every ship, because for the first time since awakening, the warship was choosing a target, and the scanners locked onto the largest dreadnought in the Tyrant coalition, a towering battleship filled with thousands of soldiers, loud with alarms and frantic cries, and Emperor Vesk felt his blood turn to ice as his screen flashed red, targeted, and before he could speak, before he could plead, before he could scream, the warship fired, not a barrage, not a storm, not a roaring blast, just a single beam, thin, silent, almost gentle, like a ray of light passing through fog, and in the instant that beam touched the dreadnought, it didn't explode, didn't break apart, didn't burn. It simply disappeared, erased from existence. Erased so completely that space looked untouched, smooth, empty, as if the dreadnought had never been there, as if thousands of lives had been swallowed by the void in a single, breathless moment. And the silence that followed was louder than any scream, louder than any explosion, louder than war itself, because every soldier, every commander, every witness felt the horror drive deep into their souls, felt their minds struggle to understand what they had seen, felt their hearts crumble beneath the weight of the impossible. One shot, one beam, one breath of power had erased the greatest warship in the fleet, and it had done so without effort, without recoil, without sound, without emotion, and Mora dropped to her knees, tears pouring from her eyes, her voice breaking as she whispered, "It erased them," like they were nothing. And across the ship's soldiers sobbed, commanders shook, leaders stared in stunned terror, because they finally understood the true danger, the horrifying secret of the ancient warship. It wasn't just powerful. It wasn't just advanced. It wasn't just unstoppable. It was designed to end wars before they began, designed to erase threats instantly, designed to destroy without hesitation, and Emperor Vesk screamed in agony, his voice cracking into madness as he realized thousands under his command had vanished in an instant, and Admiral Zatha covered his face with trembling hands as guilt and terror crushed him, because he knew what came next, knew this was only the beginning, knew that once a weapon like this fired back, it would not stop, and as the glowing veins brightened to blinding white, as the weapon array shifted again, preparing for another shot, every heart in the fleets echoed the same desperate, breaking thought. They had not just awakened a weapon, they had awakened judgment after the dreadnought vanished into nothing, after thousands of lives were erased in a single silent breath. The five empires finally understood fear in its purest form, not the fear of death, not the fear of losing a battle, but the fear of facing something far beyond their understanding, far beyond their science, far beyond their history, and the battlefield that once roared with pride and arrogance now fell into a crushing silence, a silence so heavy it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting, watching, judging, and every commander stared at the empty space where the dreadnought had once been, eyes wide, trembling, unable to comprehend how a ship, a massive war machine built with the greatest technology of an empire, could be erased so cleanly, so perfectly, without debris, without light, without sound. And Mora, still on her knees, whispered through shaking lips, "That wasn't destruction, it was deletion." And those words stabbed through every heart, because they captured a horrifying truth. The warship hadn't damaged the dreadnought, it had removed it, erased it from existence like a word wiped from a page, and the terror of that realization filled every soul with a sickness so deep it felt like poison. Because if one shot could erase a dreadnought, then what could stop the ship from erasing fleets, planets, moons, maybe even stars? And Admiral Zatha's voice cracked as he whispered to himself, barely audible, "What kind of weapon is this? What did humans build?" And no one had an answer, no one could even guess, because their minds refused to imagine something so powerful, something so absolute, something so final. And for a long moment the warship remained still, silent, watching, its glowing lines pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. And that silence was worse than the attack, worse than the beam, worse than the erasure, because it felt like the ship was thinking, remembering, deciding, and that thought alone drove panic deeper into every soldier's bones. Because machines did not think, machines did not judge, Machines did not wait. But this warship did, and in the control room of the Varel flagship, a desperate team of scientists dug through every database, searching for details, searching for answers, searching for anything human that could explain this nightmare, and suddenly one of them gasped, his face draining of color as he pulled up an ancient classified file. A file so old the system struggled to open it. And when it finally appeared, the room fell silent, because the file showed blueprints of the same warship, same shape, same structure, same weapons, labeled with a name that sent chills down every spine. Project Oblivion, and the data beneath it was worse, far worse, because it revealed the ship wasn't a relic of human weakness, it wasn't a primitive design, it wasn't even outdated, it was a superweapon from a lost era of human war, built thousands of years ago when humanity faced extinction from a threat so powerful the galaxy erased all records of it. And the scientists trembled as they read the final note on the file, a note written in old human script but translated clearly. If humanity falls, the galaxy will not survive. And those words hit the fleets like a storm, because they implied something unthinkable. Humans did not build this ship to fight other species. Humans built it during a war so catastrophic, so devastating, so apocalyptic that the galaxy itself nearly died. A war humanity somehow survived, alone, abandoned, forgotten, and Mora's voice cracked with emotion as she whispered. They built this because they were losing, and no one helped them. And the emotional weight of that truth crushed every proud heart, because the galaxy had mocked humans, ignored their suffering, dismissed their history, and now the empires finally saw the cost of their ignorance. Humanity had built a weapon not out of pride, not out of conquest, but out of desperation, out of pain, out of the burning will to never be helpless again. And Admiral Zather's hands shook so violently he could barely stand, because he understood now that the rusty exterior had been a disguise, a shell hiding a power born from trauma. And he whispered, voice broken, "This is not primitive, this is ancient human genius." And the fear shifted into something deeper, something heavier, regret, pure and overwhelming regret, because they finally realized they had attacked not an old relic, not a forgotten ship, but a monument to humanity's darkest hour. A weapon forged in silence, left drifting in space as a reminder, a warning, a message the galaxy failed to hear. And another scientist, pale and trembling, read the last line of the file aloud, his voice barely steady. If this ship awakens, it means humanity has been attacked again. And that truth shattered the fleets completely, because it meant the warship was not reacting to arrogance, not reacting to pride, not reacting to curiosity. It was reacting to aggression, responding automatically to any threat against Earth, against humans, against their legacy, and Mora covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face, understanding the final terrifying truth. The ship had been watching, waiting for the first strike, waiting for a sign of danger, waiting for the moment the galaxy repeated its betrayal, and when the 5 empires fired, the ship simply followed its code, a code written thousands of years ago, a code that meant one thing. If humans are attacked, the galaxy pays the price, and as the glowing veins brightened again, as the weapon array shifted, aiming toward another fleet, every soul in the 5 empires knew the truth too late. The warship wasn't just powerful, it was a promise. And now that promise had been unleashed, the truth of Project Oblivion spread through the fleets like a cold wind cutting straight into bone. Every empire finally felt their pride collapse completely, leaving only fear, regret, and a painful silence that no one dared break, and the ancient warship hovered motionless in the void, its glowing veins pulsing brighter and brighter, its weapon arrays shifting with terrifying precision, and the 5 empires felt the same horrible certainty rise in their chests. Another shot was coming, another erasure, another fleet about to vanish into nothing, and Admiral Zather trembled so violently he could barely stand, gripping the edge of his console with shaking hands as he whispered in a broken voice, "We have to beg, we have to try, we have to tell them we surrender." And those words, once unthinkable to a proud commander, now felt like the only thread between life and annihilation, and across the fleet's captains shouted panicked orders to open communication channels, to send messages of peace, of apology, of desperation. But every signal died the moment it left the ships, absorbed by the same invisible field that had swallowed their scans. Their weapons, their hope, and the helplessness hit so hard that soldiers began to sob at their stations, their voices cracking with terror. their bodies shaking like children facing a storm too big to understand, and Mora pressed her hands to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "We can't stop it. We can't even speak to it." And the emotional pain of that truth felt worse than death, because there was no chance to explain, no chance to plead, no chance to undo what they had done, and as the glowing light on the warship's main cannon reached blinding intensity, dozens of ships turned away instinctively, powerless to move, powerless to retreat, powerless to escape the judgment they had awakened. And then, just as the beam reached its peak, everything stopped. The cannon froze mid-charge, the glowing vanes dimmed slightly, the pressure in the air dissolved, and the fleets gasped in confusion, staring at the silent weapon, trying to understand why it hadn't fired. What had interrupted the unstoppable force, and suddenly every screen on every ship flickered, static dancing across the displays, lights glitching for a heartbeat before a new symbol appeared. An emblem no alien had seen in more than 1,000 years. A simple blue circle with a single white star at its center. The ancient insignia of Earth, of humanity, of a civilization the galaxy had mocked and dismissed. And as the logo hovered in silence, a voice emerged, deep, calm, steady, unmistakably human, echoing across every speaker, every channel, every soul. "We warned you." And the words hit harder than any weapon, harder than any beam, harder than any erasure, because they carried not anger, not rage, but disappointment. Heavy, crushing disappointment. Like a parent speaking to a reckless child. And the voice continued, slow and controlled. "We did not seek this. We did not provoke this. We did not start this." And Admiral Zather felt his knees buckle as the truth stabbed through him. Everything that had happened, every death, every terror, every erasure, had been triggered by their own arrogance, their own cruelty, their own belief that humanity was small and powerless, and the human voice grew quieter, almost sorrowful. "You struck first." And the shame of those words was unbearable, cutting through every commander's pride like a blade, because they knew it was true, knew they had fired in arrogance, laughed in ignorance, mocked what they did not understand, and now the universe was demanding the price, and the voice sharpened slightly, not with anger but with unwavering conviction. "We do not seek war." And the fleets trembled, because they knew the next truth before it was spoken, felt it like a weight crushing their lungs, and when the voice continued, it carried a strength so ancient, so unbreakable. It felt carved into the bones of time itself. "But we do not fall." And those 5 words shattered the last remnants of their delusion, because they finally understood humanity was not weak, not primitive, not ignorant. Humanity was enduring, resilient, forged in suffering the galaxy could not imagine, and Mora let out a broken sob, her voice trembling as she whispered, "They survived something worse than us." And that realization made the fleets shake with awe and dread, because it meant this warship, this weapon, this force was not born from victory but from near extinction. And the human voice continued, softer now, heavy with memory. "When we begged for aid, there was silence. When we were dying, there was silence. When our skies burned, there was silence." And the emotional weight of that history crushed every alien heart, filling them with guilt so deep it hurt to breathe, because the galaxy had once abandoned humanity, turned away, left them to die in a forgotten war, and now the consequences had awakened, and finally, the voice spoke its final message, each word slow and absolute. "We are patient. We endure. We remember." And then the screens went dark, the logo vanished, and the battlefield fell into a silence more terrifying than anything before, because the fleets now understood the greatest truth of all. The warship was not acting alone. It was acting as humanity's voice. Humanity was alive. Humanity was watching. Humanity had not fallen. And as the glowing veins on the ship flickered back to life, brighter than ever, every soul in the 5 empires felt a single thought rise like ice in their blood. If the humans were speaking now, then their true power had yet to be seen. When the screens went dark and the human voice faded into silence, the 5 empires were left trembling in a fear so deep it felt like their bones were turning to ice. Because silence from something that powerful was not peace, it was judgment, and every soldier felt it, every commander felt it, every living witness felt it. The feeling that their fate was no longer in their own hands, that their future belonged to a force they could neither understand nor control, and Admiral Zather stood frozen, staring at the ancient warship as its glowing veins pulsed brighter, thicker, faster, filling the void with a light that felt almost alive, and a sickening truth crawled into his chest, heavy and suffocating. This was not over, not even close, because the warship hadn't fired again, hadn't moved, hadn't attacked, and that restraint was more terrifying than destruction. Because it meant the ship was waiting, thinking, deciding, and Emperor-esque, still shaking, whispered through cracked lips, "It's choosing." And those two words spread through the fleets like poison, killing whatever tiny hope remained. Because no one wanted to believe that a single ship had the power to decide the fate of entire empires. Yet every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of light made the truth clearer. This ancient human weapon held the power of choice, and the galaxy had given it a reason to use it, and then, without warning, the warship's lights dimmed to almost nothing, its glowing veins fading until only a faint pulse remained, like the final breath of a sleeping titan, and for a second a fragile, desperate hope flickered across the fleets, a hope that maybe the ship was shutting down, powering off, returning to silence, returning to sleep, but Mora felt her stomach twist with dread, because the ship wasn't dying, it was changing, its energy readings shifting, rising, expanding outward instead of inward, and she gasped, voice shaking, "It's scanning, not us, space." And suddenly the radar screens across every fleet exploded with signals, alarms blaring, lights flashing, systems shaking under the pressure of impossible data. Because in every direction, across the star map, hundreds, no, thousands, of energy signatures were appearing, blinking into existence one after another like stars being born out of darkness, each signature identical to the warship, each one pulsing with the same unreadable power, the same ancient code, the same terrifying presence, and soldiers screamed, scientists collapsed. Commanders stared in horror as the map filled with the shapes of ships that were never there before, ships hidden beyond sensors, ships cloaked in silence, ships waiting in the black for a signal, and the emotional shock was so massive it felt like the galaxy itself shattered. Because the old warship drifting near the moon, the one they mocked, the one they attacked, was not alone, it had never been alone, it was one among many, one of a fleet so vast, so widespread, so unimaginable that the five empires could barely breathe, barely think, barely stand under the crushing weight of the truth. Humanity had built not one superweapon, but hundreds, maybe thousands, hidden across space like sleeping giants, and Admiral Zather fell to his knees, tears spilling down his face as he whispered in broken horror, "We didn't awaken a ship, we awakened a network." And the terror of that realization consumed every soul, because if the ancient warship was a warning, then this infinite web of silent vessels, was a message, a promise, a threat no one could ignore. And then, as the fleets stared at the expanding map, a final transmission flickered onto every screen, short, cold, undeniable, spoken in a voice that carried the weight of an entire civilization. Protocol 1, awaiting human command. And those words shattered the last breath of hope, because they meant the warship had not acted on its own, had not unleashed its full power, had not reached the end of its purpose. It was waiting for orders, waiting for direction, waiting for humanity itself to speak again. And if humanity gave that order, if humanity chose to unleash the fleet, then the galaxy would burn in silence, erased like the dreadnought, erased like dust in darkness, erased without time to scream. And Mora covered her face with trembling hands as she whispered the final, horrifying truth that every mind now understood. We thought humans were gone, but what if they're coming back? And in that moment every empire felt the same chilling realization. The war with humanity had never truly begun, and the galaxy was no longer the hunter. It was the prey.